3 years of marriage without intimacy, until one passionate night, the billionaire makes her truly his. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you today with hearts full of gratitude and love. We thank you for the gift of life, for the strength to face each day, and for the love that surrounds us. We ask for your guidance and blessings as we share this story, a story of love, redemption, and the power of connection. May it touch the hearts of everyone watching and remind them of the true meaning of love and marriage. Amen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. Today's story isn't just a story, it's a powerful lesson for all husbands and wives. It's about the importance of love, connection, and not letting life's distractions steal the intimacy from your marriage. Trust me, this story will touch your heart and leave you with a beautiful message. So please, stay with me till the very end. You definitely don't want to miss a single moment. And before we start, I have a humble request. If you enjoy this story and want to hear more heartfelt content like this, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means everything and helps us continue to bring you meaningful stories like this. So, without further delay, let's dive into today's story. Stay with me until the end. You'll be glad you did. Kellen and Alina had been married for 3 long years, but their marriage resembled a carefully structured business contract more than a union of love and passion. Kellen, a powerful and successful billionaire with a reputation for ruthlessness in the boardroom, commanded the business world with an iron fist. He was always engrossed in meetings, traveling across continents, closing deals, and building his empire, leaving little room for anything else, least of all his marriage. Alina, on the other hand, was a stunningly beautiful black woman whose smooth brown skin glowed like polished amber under the softest light. Her captivating brown eyes held a quiet depth of longing, and her dark, intricately braided hair framed her face like a crown of delicate art. She was breathtaking, the kind of woman whose beauty could halt conversations the moment she entered a room. Yet, despite her striking appearance and gentle heart, she remained invisible to the one person whose attention she craved the most, her husband. Theirs was a marriage built on status and expectation rather than love, and while Kellen had provided Alina with everything money could buy, a luxurious mansion, designer clothes, jewelry that could make even royalty jealous, he had failed to give her the one thing she truly wanted: his love. Nights in their massive penthouse were cold and silent. Alina would lie in their king-sized bed, the satin sheets cool beneath her skin, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as the distant sounds of the city buzzed outside. Kellen would often come home late, the scent of expensive cologne and the exhaustion of a long day clinging to him as he wordlessly changed and slipped into bed beside her. But there was always distance, a hollow space between their bodies, even as they lay beneath the same blanket. He never reached for her, never kissed her goodnight, never held her when the loneliness became unbearable. Alina would sometimes turn toward him, her heart pounding as she studied his chiseled face in the dim moonlight, her fingers aching to touch him, to run through his dark hair, to trace the hard lines of his jaw. But she held back. His breathing would be steady, his eyes closed, and she knew better than to disturb him. Her longing was a silent scream trapped in her chest, growing louder with each passing day. She had tried in the beginning to bridge the gap between them. On their first anniversary, she had arranged a private dinner on the rooftop of their home. She had worn a red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, her braids styled down her back, her lips painted a sultry shade of crimson. Kellen had shown up late, his phone pressed to his ear as he discussed a deal that, according to him, couldn't wait. He had barely glanced at her as he sat down, cutting short her attempt at conversation with a curt nod and a distracted smile. Alina had smiled through it, swallowing her disappointment as he left early to prepare for a morning flight. On other nights, she would dress up, wearing the lingerie he had bought her but never noticed, walking into their bedroom hoping for a flicker of desire in his eyes. But Kaylin's gaze would skim over her like she was a shadow on the wall. It wasn't that he was cruel. He wasn't. He was polite and respectful, providing for her every need. But that was the problem. He treated her like an obligation, not a lover. Alina's patience was tested every day. She would sit by the large glass windows in their penthouse, watching the city lights, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she wondered what she was doing wrong. Why didn't he want her? Was it her? She knew men looked at her. When they went to social events, Kaylin's business associates and friends often stole glances at her, their admiration obvious. But Kaylin seemed immune to her beauty. It was as if he had built a wall between them, and no matter how hard Alina tried to climb it, it remained unyielding. Sometimes Alina wondered if Kaylin regretted marrying her. Their wedding had been a grand affair, a merging of business and social empires, with the press calling it the wedding of the year. Kaylin had smiled for the cameras, his arm wrapped around her waist as he kissed her forehead. But even then, Alina had felt the emptiness beneath his touch. He had been marrying her because it was expected, not because he loved her. That realization had haunted her since. Despite her growing sense of loneliness, Alina remained patient. She held on to the hope that one day Kaylin would see her, not just as a partner in marriage, but as a woman. She dreamed of the day he would pull her into his arms without hesitation, when he would kiss her with the passion she saw in movies, when he would whisper words of love and desire into her ear as he made her feel wanted. But as the months turned into years, that hope began to dim. One evening, after yet another lonely dinner at their massive dining table, Alina confronted him. "Kaylin," she said, her voice calm but her hands trembling, "do you even want to be married to me?" Kaylin had looked up from his phone, his brows furrowing slightly. "What kind of question is that?" Alina's eyes burned. "A real one. You're never here. You don't talk to me. You don't even touch me." Kaylin had sighed, setting his phone down. He stood, walking over to her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Alina, I'm busy. You know that." Alina's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I don't need your money, Kaylin. I need you." But Kaylin had simply kissed her forehead, a distant, cold kiss, before walking away. That night, Alina had curled up in bed, her tears soaking her pillow as Kaylin slept beside her, oblivious to the pain radiating from her heart. She began to wonder if this was what the rest of her life would be, a life without love, without passion, without connection. Despite the emptiness, Alina couldn't bring herself to leave. She loved Kaylin, even if he didn't love her back. And so she stayed, hoping, praying that one day he would see her, truly see her, and realize that he had a treasure right in front of him. Alina's patience was wearing thin, but her heart refused to give up. Somewhere deep inside her, she believed that Kaylin would wake up one day and finally reach for her, finally claim her as his own. She just didn't know how much longer she could wait. Alina stood in front of the full-length mirror in their luxurious bedroom, adjusting the silk dress that hugged her curves perfectly. The rich chocolate hue of the fabric contrasted beautifully with her smooth brown skin, and her carefully braided hair cascaded down her back like a crown of dark silk. Her brown eyes shimmered beneath the soft glow of the room's ambient lighting, a quiet plea buried in their depths. Tonight she had taken extra care in her appearance, applying a subtle touch of makeup that highlighted her high cheekbones and full lips. Her slender figure was framed elegantly by the dress's delicate straps, the fabric clinging to her body in a way that would have turned any man's head. But as Alina stood there, studying herself in the mirror, she knew deep down that the only gaze she wanted to capture was Kaylin's. And that was the problem, because no matter how breathtaking she looked, Kaylin's gaze never lingered. He saw her, but he didn't see her. Her heart fluttered with a foolish hope as the sound of Kaylin's footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. The soft creak of the bedroom door made her pulse quicken, and when Kaylin walked in, dressed in his usual tailored suit, his dark eyes cool and calculating, Alina held her breath. His gaze flicked over her for a fleeting moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if registering her beauty. But then his phone buzzed and, just like that, his attention was gone. He turned away, lifting the phone to his ear, and began speaking in that low, authoritative tone that made his employees tremble. Alina's heart sank as she watched him, standing there with his back turned to her, the indifference cutting deeper than any insult could. She crossed the room slowly, the sound of her heels against the marble floor echoing through the quiet space. When Kaylin finally ended the call, Alina stood directly in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "Did you even notice what I'm wearing?" she asked softly. Kaylin's gaze finally met hers, his dark eyes briefly softening as they skimmed over her dress. "You look nice," he said, his tone polite but distant. Alina's heart twisted painfully. Nice. That was it? After all this time, after all the effort? She fought the lump in her throat and forced a smile. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping back as Kaylin moved past her toward his desk, already pulling out his laptop. Alina watched him as he settled down, his fingers flying over the keyboard, his focus entirely consumed by whatever deal he was working on. A sharp ache bloomed in her chest as she sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the soft fabric of her dress. This had become their pattern. She would reach out and Kellen would gently, politely push her away. He was never unkind to her. In fact, he was always courteous. He bought her gifts, provided for her every need, and spoke to her with respect. But there was a wall between them, invisible yet unbreakable. Alina had watched other couples. She had seen the way her friends' husbands would reach for them without hesitation, the way their eyes would light up with affection, the way they would laugh together and share quiet moments of intimacy that didn't require words. And every time Alina saw that, her heart cracked a little more. She had married one of the most powerful men in the world, a man who could make entire industries rise or fall with a single decision, but she had never felt more alone. And the cruelest part was that Kaylin wasn't blind to it. He knew. She could see it in the way his eyes would linger on her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, the brief flicker of warmth that would cross his face before he buried it beneath that mask of cool professionalism. Deep down, Kaylin admired her. He admired her strength, her grace, the quiet way she carried herself even when ignored. He saw her beauty. Alina knew that. But admiration wasn't love, and it certainly wasn't desire. Alina had tried to break through the wall between them. She had confronted him before, several times in fact. One evening after Kaylin had returned home late from yet another business meeting, Alina had stood in the doorway of his office, her arms crossed. "Kaylin," she had said, her voice steady but strained, "why don't you touch me?" Kaylin had looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowing slightly. "Alina, not now. I'm busy," she had finished for him, her voice sharp. "You're always busy, Kaylin. Always working, always talking about the next deal. But what about us? What about me?" Kaylin had sighed, rubbing his temple. "Alina, you know how important this is. The company—" "I don't care about the company," Alina had cut in, her voice breaking. "I care about you, about us." Kaylin had stood then, his tall frame looming over her as he reached for her hand. His touch had been cool, distant. "Alina, you're overthinking this." She had pulled her hand away. "No, I'm not. I'm starving, Kaylin. I'm starving for you to love me, to want me." Kaylin's jaw had tightened. "Alina, this is just how I am. I'm not good at emotions." "But you're my husband," Alina had whispered. "You don't have to be perfect, Kaylin. You just have to try." He had said nothing after that, his expression hardening as he kissed her forehead, a mechanical gesture that only made her feel more hollow inside. And so Alina had stopped asking. She had stopped trying to reach for him, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would come to her instead. But he never did. Until one night, Alina had come home from a charity event alone, having grown tired of standing alone while other wives were wrapped in their husbands' arms. She had taken off her gown, slipped into the shower, and let the hot water wash away the sting of loneliness clinging to her skin. When she stepped out, her smooth brown skin glowed beneath the soft light of the bathroom, droplets of water sliding down her curves. She had wrapped herself in a thin silk robe, her damp braids falling over her shoulders as she stepped into the bedroom. Kalin had been sitting at the edge of the bed, his phone in his hand. But when Alina walked in, his gaze had lifted, and for the first time in years, his eyes stayed. His gaze swept over her slowly, darkening as it traveled down the curve of her bare collarbone, the slope of her shoulders, the delicate outline of her breasts beneath the thin fabric. Alina's breath had caught as Kalin stood, his phone slipping from his hand onto the floor with a soft thud. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he crossed the room toward her. And then, just when Alina had prepared herself for him to walk away as he always did, Kalin reached out. His hand brushed against her cheek, his thumb skimming the corner of her mouth. "Alina," he had whispered, his voice low and rough. And for the first time in 3 years, Alina had seen desire in his eyes, not just admiration, not just respect, but hunger. That moment had been a shift, something stirring beneath the surface of their broken marriage. But for now, Alina could only hope that it wouldn't fade as quickly as it had appeared. She was still waiting, still aching for the day Kalin would claim her as his own. The evening sun cast a soft amber glow across the balcony, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. Alina stood there, her slender frame outlined against the backdrop of the setting sun. The warm breeze lifted her neatly braided hair, causing the dark tendrils to sway gently over her smooth brown shoulders. Her elegant figure was draped in a soft satin dress, the delicate fabric catching the light and reflecting it against her brown skin, making her glow in the evening light. Her brown eyes, rich and deep, glistened as they scanned the horizon, the distant hum of the city blending with the quiet rustle of the breeze. Her lips parted slightly as she took in the sight of the sunset, a view so breathtakingly beautiful, yet so achingly lonely. Despite the perfection surrounding her, the emptiness inside her chest felt louder than the soft whispers of the evening air. She wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of loneliness pressing heavily against her chest. A soft sound of footsteps echoed behind her, and her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Kalin. His presence was familiar, the quiet strength in his steps, the scent of his expensive cologne drifting toward her as he stepped into the room. He had just returned from work, and Alina could tell from the tension in his posture that he was exhausted. His dark suit was crisp, his tie slightly loosened at the neck, and his black hair was slightly tousled, as if he had run his hands through it multiple times during the day. Alina turned her head slightly, her eyes catching the reflection of him in the glass doors behind her. Kalin's gaze was fixed on her for a moment, his dark eyes scanning her figure, the soft outline of her shoulders beneath the satin fabric of her dress. But then his expression hardened, his face returning to that cold, unreadable mask he always wore. Alina swallowed the ache rising in her throat and turned toward him. "You're home," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Kalin's gaze flicked toward her briefly before he slipped off his jacket and tossed it onto a nearby chair. "Yes," he said simply, his tone clipped. Alina's fingers curled against the cool metal of the balcony railing. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Would you join me?" Her voice was gentle, hesitant, as if she was afraid of being rejected, because deep down she already knew the answer. Kaelin's brow furrowed slightly as his gaze met hers. For a moment there was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability beneath the cool exterior. Alina held her breath as Kaelin stood still, his eyes studying her carefully. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the tension in his jawline, the weariness in his eyes. He looked like a man burdened by the weight of the world, but Alina wasn't asking him to carry that burden alone. She was asking him to stand beside her, to share even a single moment of intimacy. After a long pause, Kaelin sighed softly and walked toward her. He stopped beside her, his hand resting lightly on the railing. They stood there together in silence, their shoulders nearly touching, the warmth of his presence so close yet so painfully distant. Alina's gaze drifted back toward the horizon, but her thoughts were entirely consumed by the man standing beside her. The sound of his breathing, the quiet heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne. It all reminded her how close he was physically, yet emotionally he felt miles away. Alina's heart clenched painfully in her chest. She lowered her gaze, her lashes brushing against her cheeks as the ache inside her intensified. Her lips parted, and before she could stop herself, the words slipped out. "Why did we even marry, Kaelin?" Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but it sliced through the heavy silence between them like a blade. Kaelin's body stiffened beside her. His hand tightened slightly on the railing, and his jawline flexed as if the question had struck him harder than any physical blow. Alina's heart raced as she turned toward him, her brown eyes searching his face for any sign of emotion. But Kaelin's expression remained cold, guarded. His dark eyes narrowed slightly as he looked toward the horizon. Seconds passed, then more. Kaelin said nothing. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Alina's chest tightened as tears burned at the back of her eyes. "Do you even love me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kaelin's gaze flicked toward her, his eyes darkening. "Alina," he began, his tone low and controlled. Alina shook her head, the tears slipping past her lashes and falling down her cheeks. "Just answer me," she pleaded. "Do you love me? Or was this marriage just a convenient arrangement for you?" Kaelin's expression tightened, a shadow passing over his face. "I married you because it made sense," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was logical." Alina's breath hitched painfully in her throat. "Logical?" she echoed, her voice breaking. Kaelin's gaze remained steady, cold. "It benefited both of us. You needed stability, and I needed a wife who could stand beside me without scandal. We agreed to this." Alina's hand flew to her chest, as if trying to hold herself together as her heart splintered beneath his words. "But I loved you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't marry you for convenience, Kaelin. I married you because I loved you. I still love you." Kaelin's face remained stoic, but Alina saw the faint flicker of conflict in his eyes, a brief glimpse of the man beneath the mask, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He straightened, his expression hardening. "Alina, you knew what this was when we started," he said, his tone cold. Alina's breath trembled as her vision blurred with tears. "No," she whispered. "I thought we could grow into something more. I thought you would, eventually." Her voice trailed off. Kaelin's eyes darkened, his mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to say something, but then he stopped himself. After a long, heavy silence, Kaelin's gaze lowered. "I have a meeting early tomorrow," he said quietly. "Good night, Alina." And just like that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the quiet room. Alina stood frozen, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing like a gunshot in her chest. Her hand lifted to her lips, stifling the broken sob that escaped her throat. Alone again. always alone. The amber glow of the sunset faded into twilight, and Alina stood there beneath the darkening sky, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as the cold ache of loneliness wrapped around her heart like a vice. Later that night, the cold emptiness in the room pressed down on Alina like a heavy blanket. The conversation on the balcony still echoed in her mind, each of Kaylin's cold words cutting deeper into her heart. She lay on the edge of the large bed, her arms crossed over her chest as her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The sound of the city lights humming beyond the large glass windows seemed distant, lost beneath the deafening thud of her own heartbeat. Kaylin was sitting at the desk on the far side of the room, his laptop open, his dark eyes fixed on the screen as if the conversation they had earlier hadn't even happened. His posture was stiff, his fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision. Alina turned her head slightly, watching him. He was so handsome, tall and lean, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt that clung to the sculpted muscles beneath. His black hair was slightly tousled, and the soft glow from the screen cast shadows across his chiseled jawline and intense eyes. He was every bit the powerful billionaire that the world saw, a man who commanded attention and respect. But to Alina, he was also the man who had just admitted that their marriage had been nothing more than a logical arrangement. The weight of his indifference crushed her chest, suffocating her. Her lips trembled as tears threatened to fall again. She needed to breathe. She needed to escape the coldness in the room, the hollow emptiness of her marriage. Slowly, she pushed herself off the bed and walked toward the ensuite bathroom. Kaylin's eyes lifted briefly from his screen, watching her as she disappeared behind the frosted glass door. But he didn't say a word. The door clicked shut behind her, and Alina leaned against it for a moment, her chest heaving as she fought to keep herself together. Her reflection stared back at her from the large mirror above the sink. Her brown eyes were filled with sadness, her lips slightly swollen from biting down on them to keep from crying. Slowly, she reached for the edge of her satin nightdress and pulled it over her head, letting the soft fabric slide down her brown skin. The coolness of the air made her shiver as she stepped into the large glass shower and turned on the water. The warm stream cascaded over her skin, washing away the tension and pain clinging to her body. Alina closed her eyes and let the heat seep into her muscles, her braids growing heavier as the water soaked them. Her hands slid down her arms and over her waist as she leaned her forehead against the glass. Silent tears mixed with the water as it streamed down her face. Her body ached, not from exhaustion, but from the deep emptiness inside her. For 3 years, she had waited for Kaylin to see her, to truly see her. She had been patient, had convinced herself that the distance between them would fade with time. But now she wasn't sure anymore. Her fingertips pressed against the glass as frustration twisted painfully in her chest. Why had he married her if he didn't want her? Why had he chosen her if she was nothing more than a convenient wife? The sound of the water filled the air, the steam fogging the glass as Alina's breathing steadied. She stayed there for a long time, letting the warmth calm her racing heart. Finally, when her skin was flushed and her braids were dripping with water, Alina reached for a soft towel and wrapped it around herself. Slowly, she stepped out of the shower and stood in front of the mirror. Her brown skin glowed under the soft bathroom lights, and the moisture from the shower made her skin shimmer. Her brown eyes were wide and soft, framed by her long lashes. Her braids clung to her shoulders, dark and wet, enhancing the elegant curves of her neck. Despite the sadness lingering in her heart, she looked beautiful, stunning. She slipped into a silk nightgown, midnight blue, thin straps resting against her shoulders, the fabric hugging the curve of her waist and cascading down to her thighs. Her chest rose and fell beneath the delicate fabric, her figure outlined perfectly. The cool silk clung to her damp skin as she smoothed the gown down her hips. With a soft breath, she stepped toward the bedroom. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the bedside lamp casting warm shadows across the large bed and the glass walls. Kellen was still at the desk, his fingers moving across the keyboard, but the moment Alina stepped into the room, the air shifted. Kalen's gaze lifted, and then his fingers froze on the keyboard. His dark eyes widened slightly as his gaze landed on her. His breath visibly hitched as he took her in, her brown skin glowing under the soft light, the silk clinging to the curves of her body, her braids framing her stunning face. She looked like a goddess standing there, effortless beauty, sensual and vulnerable at the same time. Kalen's throat worked as he swallowed hard. He had always known Alina was beautiful, but tonight she was devastatingly irresistible. Alina's gaze met his, her brown eyes wide and vulnerable. A delicate blush crept across her cheeks as Kalen's gaze swept down the length of her body, lingering on the exposed curve of her collarbone and the swell of her chest beneath the silk. His jaw tightened, his breath deepening as his dark eyes darkened. He closed the laptop and stood slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. Alina's heart pounded in her chest as he took a step toward her. "Alina." His voice was low, rough. Her lips parted as Kalen's hand reached out and brushed a damp braid over her shoulder, his fingertips grazing the delicate skin of her neck. Alina's breath shuddered at the contact. His hand moved down, his fingers trailing along her bare shoulder and across her collarbone. A soft shiver ran through her body. Kalen's gaze lowered to her lips, his dark eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "You look beautiful," he murmured. Alina's heart stumbled. His hand moved to her waist, his palm pressing lightly against her silk-covered hip. His touch was gentle but firm, and Alina's breath hitched as heat flooded her veins. Kalen's gaze softened as his thumb brushed against the side of her waist. "Why have I never noticed?" he whispered, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Alina's lips parted as his head dipped closer, his breath fanning against her cheek. Her hands slid up to his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath his shirt. Kalen's hand moved to cup the side of her face, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. Slowly, he leaned in until their lips were inches apart. "Kalen," Alina whispered, her breath mingling with his. Kalen's dark eyes met hers, warm and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he breathed. Alina's heart squeezed painfully. Before she could respond, Kalen's lips brushed softly against hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a soft caress, but then Kalen's hand slid into her hair, his fingers threading through her damp braids as the kiss deepened. Alina's breath faltered as his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. Heat exploded through her chest as Kalen's mouth moved against hers with slow, consuming passion. Her hands fisted his shirt as his other hand slid down her back, pressing her body firmly against his. Alina gasped softly against his mouth, her knees weakening beneath the intensity of the kiss. Kalen's grip tightened on her waist as his lips trailed down her jawline, his breath hot against her skin. "Alina," he whispered, his voice rough with desire. Alina's eyes fluttered closed as Kalen's hand moved down her hip. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured. Alina's eyes opened, her heart racing as Kalen's forehead pressed against hers. "I've wasted so much time," he whispered. "Not tonight." And as his lips found hers again, Alina melted into his arms, her heart pounding wildly as the night unfolded between them in breathless, consuming passion. Kalen stood motionless for a moment, his eyes locked on Alina's radiant figure. The soft glow from the bedside lamp cast warm shadows across her brown skin, highlighting the elegant curve of her collarbone and the delicate swell of her chest beneath the thin silk nightgown. His heart pounded heavily against his ribs, the sound loud in his ears as he struggled to steady his breath. He had always known Alina was beautiful, but tonight she was breathtaking, irresistible. Something inside him shifted as he took a hesitant step toward her. His dark eyes swept over her from head to toe, taking in the smooth sheen of her skin, the way the silk clung to her slender waist and full hips, the way her damp braids cascaded over her bare shoulders. Her brown eyes were wide, vulnerable, glistening under the soft light. Kaelin's throat tightened as a wave of warmth surged through his chest, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. He had spent 3 years hiding from this, convincing himself that their marriage was nothing more than a strategic alliance, cold, logical, necessary. But standing there now, with Alina looking so soft, so beautiful, so fragile, Kaelin felt his carefully built walls beginning to crack. His jaw tightened as he took another step forward, his gaze darkening with quiet intensity. Alina's breath hitched as Kaelin's hand lifted, his fingertips brushing lightly over her bare shoulder. Her skin warmed beneath his touch, her heart racing uncontrollably. "Kaelin," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes met hers, burning with an unfamiliar softness and desire. His hand slid slowly down her arm, his fingers tracing the curve of her elbow before settling against her waist. Alina's breath shuddered at the contact. His hand was warm, steady, his touch reverent. Kaelin swallowed hard, his gaze lowering to her lips. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough and low. Alina's heart stammered painfully. Her lips parted as Kaelin's thumb brushed over her cheekbone, his hand cupping the side of her face with delicate care. Her brown eyes fluttered closed as Kaelin leaned in, his breath warming her skin as his forehead pressed lightly against hers. His fingers slid into her damp braids, his thumb caressing the soft skin just below her ear. "I've been such a fool," he murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. Alina's chest rose and fell rapidly as Kaelin's hand slid down her back, his palm pressing against the curve of her waist. Her hands lifted hesitantly, resting against his chest. His heartbeat was strong and fast beneath her palms. Slowly, Kaelin's lips brushed against her forehead, lingering there before moving lower, his mouth trailing down her cheek, her jawline. Alina's breath caught as his lips hovered over hers, their breaths mingling. "Kaelin," Alina whispered, her fingers tightening against his chest. Kaelin's gaze darkened as he finally closed the distance between them. His lips pressed against hers in a soft, tentative kiss. But the moment Alina sighed into his mouth, the kiss deepened. Kaelin's hand slid up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her braids as his mouth moved hungrily against hers. Alina melted beneath the intensity of the kiss, her body pressing into his as warmth surged through her veins. Kaelin's other hand slid down her back, cupping the curve of her hip as he pulled her closer. His tongue teased the seam of her lips, and Alina opened for him, gasping softly as Kaelin's tongue slid against hers in a deep, sensual stroke. A soft moan escaped her lips as Kaelin's hand tightened at her waist, his mouth dominating hers with aching precision. Alina's knees weakened beneath the heat of his touch. Kaelin lifted her effortlessly into his arms, his strong hands supporting her as he carried her toward the bed. Alina's arms wrapped around his neck, her lips still fused with his as he lowered her onto the soft sheets. Kaelin's mouth never left hers as he settled above her, his body pressing into hers. His hand slid down her side, caressing the curve of her waist, her hip. Alina's breath hitched as Kaelin's lips left her mouth, trailing down the delicate line of her throat. His breath was hot against her skin, his lips pressing reverently against her pulse. Alina's head tilted back, her fingers threading through his dark hair as he pressed open-mouthed kisses along her collarbone. Kaelin's hand slid beneath the thin silk of her nightgown, his fingers splaying over the soft skin of her thigh. Alina gasped as his mouth moved lower, his lips brushing the swell of her chest beneath the fabric. Kaelin's hand tightened at her hip, his body pressing harder against hers as his breath grew heavier. "Alina," he whispered, his voice rough and strained. Alina's eyes fluttered open, her heart pounding as Kalin lifted his head to look at her. His dark eyes were filled with vulnerability and longing. "I need you," he whispered. "I've always needed you." Alina's breath shuddered as her hands cupped the sides of his face. "Then take me," she whispered. Kalen's eyes darkened as a low sound rumbled in his chest. His lips crashed against hers in a deep, searing kiss as his hands pushed the silk higher, his palms caressing the bare skin beneath. Alina's back arched beneath him, her body reacting helplessly to the heat of his touch. Kalen's hand slid beneath her, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine as his mouth moved hungrily against hers. His breath was ragged, his body trembling beneath the intensity of his own desire. Alina's hands slid down his back, her nails digging into the fabric of his shirt. Kellen groaned against her mouth as his hand slid higher, his palm cupping her bare skin beneath the nightgown. "God, Alina," he whispered. "You feel incredible." Alina's head fell back as Kalen's lips trailed down her throat, his hand sliding down her thigh. His mouth pressed reverently against the hollow of her throat as his hand tangled in her braids. "I can't stop," he whispered, his breath ragged. Alina's breath hitched as Kalen's lips captured hers once more, his mouth moving hungrily, desperately. His hand slid down to her thigh, hooking her leg around his waist as his body pressed harder into hers. Alina's fingers tangled in his hair as her body ignited beneath his touch. Kalen's breath was harsh against her skin as his hand slid lower, his lips moving down the length of her throat. "Say my name," he whispered. Alina's breath shuddered. "Kalen," she breathed. His mouth curved against her skin as his hand slid back to her waist. "I've wasted so much time," he whispered, his voice heavy with regret. "Not anymore." Alina's chest rose and fell rapidly as Kalen's lips found hers again, soft and reverent this time. His hand slid beneath her back, holding her close as his mouth moved with aching tenderness. Alina's heart soared as Kalen whispered her name between soft, desperate kisses. "Alina," he murmured. "Alina." Her breath hitched as Kalen's hand slid down her back, his lips brushing her temple. "You're mine," he whispered. Alina's heart stammered painfully as Kalen's gaze darkened. "You've always been mine." And as Kalen's mouth claimed hers once more, Alina surrendered completely, her body and heart finally entwined with his in a night of raw, breathtaking passion. Alina woke to the soft warmth of sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains, casting golden patterns across the silk sheets. Her brown eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the soft glow of morning light. The first thing she became aware of was the steady rhythm of Kalen's heartbeat beneath her ear. His bare chest rose and fell gently beneath her hand, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, holding her close. Alina's breath caught as the memories of the previous night washed over her in a flood of heat and emotion. Her cheeks warmed as she remembered the way Kalen had touched her, the way he had whispered her name like a prayer, the way his body had pressed into hers with a desperate, aching need that she hadn't known he was capable of. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to look at him. Kalen's dark eyes were already open, watching her with quiet intensity. His hand slid lazily up and down her back, his fingers tracing soft patterns along her bare shoulder. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and there was a softness in his gaze that Alina had never seen before, an openness that made her heart clench painfully. "Good morning." Kalen's voice was low and rough with sleep, his lips curving into a faint smile. Alina smiled back, her fingers splaying across his chest as she leaned up to press a soft kiss to his jawline. "Good morning," she whispered against his skin. Kalen's hand slid up to the back of her neck, his fingers threading through her braids as he pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead. His eyes darkened as he pulled back to look at her. "Alina," he murmured, his gaze soft and vulnerable. "I'm sorry." Alina's heart stammered painfully in her chest. Her eyes widened slightly as Kaelin's hand slid down to cup her face. His thumb brushed tenderly over her cheekbone, his dark gaze searching hers. "I've wasted so much time," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. 3 years. 3 years of keeping you at a distance when all I ever wanted was this." Alina's breath caught as Kaelin's forehead pressed against hers. His fingers tightened in her braids as his lips hovered inches from hers. "I was a fool," Kaelin murmured. "I told myself it was easier to keep things cold, professional. I told myself I didn't need more. But I did. I always did." Alina's heart hammered painfully as tears welled up in her eyes. "I thought you didn't love me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Kaelin's gaze darkened as his hand slid down to her waist, pulling her closer. "I did love you," he said fiercely. "I just didn't know how to show it." Alina's lips parted as Kaelin's mouth brushed over hers in a soft, reverent kiss. Her fingers curled against his chest as his arm tightened around her waist. "I should have told you," he murmured against her lips. "I should have touched you. I should have made you feel how much you meant to me." Alina's throat tightened as Kaelin's lips moved down to her neck, pressing reverent kisses against her skin. Her hands slid up to tangle in his hair as his mouth traced a heated path along her collarbone. "It's not too late," Alina whispered. Kaelin's breath shuddered as he pulled back to look at her. His dark eyes were filled with vulnerability and quiet desperation. "You're sure?" he asked hoarsely. Alina's heart ached at the raw emotion in his gaze. She cupped his face between her hands and smiled softly. "It's not too late," she whispered. Kaelin's jaw tightened as his hand slid down her back, his palm pressing against the curve of her hip. His mouth curved into a small smile as he leaned down to kiss her, soft and slow. Alina's heart melted as Kaelin's hand slid into her hair, his thumb brushing against her temple. "I promise you," Kaelin murmured against her lips. "I'm done putting business before you. I'm done hiding from this." Alina's breath hitched as Kaelin's hand slid down to her thigh, his fingers tracing the smooth curve of her skin beneath the sheets. His mouth pressed against her ear, his breath hot as he whispered, "You come first now, Alina. You always will." Alina's chest rose and fell rapidly as Kaelin's mouth pressed against her neck once more. "We wasted so much time," Kaelin whispered, "but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Alina's eyes fluttered closed as Kaelin's hand slid up her back, his lips tracing a path down her jawline. "What about work?" Alina whispered breathlessly. Kaelin's mouth curved against her skin. "I don't care," he said. "Nothing matters more than you." Alina's heart stammered as Kaelin's mouth claimed hers once more in a deep, lingering kiss. Her arms slid around his neck as his body pressed into hers beneath the sheets. Kaelin's hand slid down to her waist, pulling her closer as his mouth moved hungrily against hers. Alina's breath hitched as Kaelin's lips trailed down her throat, his hand splaying possessively over her hip. "You're mine," Kaelin whispered against her skin. "You've always been mine." Alina's fingers tightened in his hair as Kaelin's mouth moved lower, his breath warm against her bare skin. "Kaelin," Alina whispered, her voice trembling. Kaelin's eyes darkened as his head lifted, his gaze locking with hers. "Say it again," he murmured. Alina's lips curved into a soft smile. "Kaelin," she whispered. Kaelin's chest tightened painfully at the sound of his name on her lips. His hand slid down to her thigh as he pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. Alina's eyes filled with tears as Kaelin's mouth brushed over hers once more. "I love you too," she whispered. Kaelin's breath hitched as his hand tightened at her waist. His mouth claimed hers in a slow, deep kiss as his body pressed into hers. Alina's heart soared as Kaelin's hands slid over her skin, his lips tracing reverent paths along her jawline. They lay wrapped in each other's arms for what felt like hours, whispering soft promises and stolen kisses as the sunlight filtered through the curtains. Kaelin's hand never left her skin, his touch soft and possessive. "I'm never letting you go," Kaelin whispered. Alina's heart swelled as her hand slid up to rest over his heart. "You don't have to," she whispered. Kaelin's hand tightened at her waist as he kissed her temple, his breath warm against her ear. "We have the rest of our lives," he whispered. Alina smiled softly as Kaelin's lips found hers once more. And as they lay entwined beneath the golden morning light, Alina knew this was the beginning of forever. From that day forward, Kaelin became a different man, a man Alina had always hoped he could be but had stopped believing in. The change didn't happen overnight, but it was steady, deliberate, and breathtakingly sincere. Kaelin began leaving work early, something unheard of for a man who had built his empire through ruthless dedication and tireless hours. His assistants were stunned when he began rescheduling late meetings, cutting back on his workload, and telling them, "Family comes first now." Alina's heart swelled the first time he showed up at home before sunset, standing in the kitchen doorway with a bouquet of white roses in his hands and a soft, almost shy smile on his lips. "These reminded me of you," he said, handing them to her. Alina's hands trembled as she took the flowers, her brown eyes wide with disbelief and quiet hope. He kissed her forehead softly and lingered, his lips pressing warmly against her skin before he wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close. Alina leaned into him, her breath hitching as she inhaled his familiar cologne, mixed with the fresh scent of roses. That night, Kaelin made her favorite dinner, surprising her with how well he remembered the little things she liked: garlic bread slightly toasted, pasta with extra basil, and a glass of white wine. They sat across from each other at the dining table, candlelight flickering between them, and for the first time in 3 years, they talked, truly talked. Kaelin listened as Alina told him about her day, her hopes, and the quiet fears she had carried alone for so long. He reached across the table, lacing his fingers with hers as he murmured, "I'm here now, Alina. I'm not going anywhere." That night wasn't just about dinner, it was the beginning of something new. Kaelin started coming home early more often, surprising Alina with thoughtful gifts, a gold bracelet engraved with their wedding date, a silk scarf in her favorite shade of crimson, and once, a handwritten note tucked under her pillow that simply read, "I love you." Kaelin took Alina on dates that made her feel like they were falling in love for the first time. He would whisk her away to elegant rooftop dinners beneath the stars, his hand never leaving the small of her back as he guided her through the crowds. He would lean close to whisper in her ear, his breath hot against her skin as he murmured, "You're the most beautiful woman here." Alina would blush and smile as Kaelin's arm tightened around her waist, his gaze dark and possessive as if daring anyone to look at her too long. He took her on quiet walks along the beach at sunset, his bare feet sinking into the sand beside hers as he laced their fingers together and pressed soft kisses to her shoulder. Alina's heart began to heal under the warmth of his love, and the tension that had once defined their marriage slowly melted away. Kaelin became more affectionate, more attentive. He kissed her forehead every morning before work, his lips lingering as his hand caressed her cheek. "Don't miss me too much," he would tease, his dark eyes sparkling as Alina's cheeks flushed. He would text her throughout the day, short, simple messages that made her smile. "Thinking about you, can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." Kaelin was addicted to her now. There was no hiding it. His hands couldn't seem to stay off her when they were alone. He would pull her into his lap when they were watching TV, his hands sliding beneath her shirt to caress her bare skin as he buried his face in her neck. "I can't believe I wasted so much time," he would whisper between kisses. Alina's laughter began to fill their home, light, bright, and full of warmth. Kaylin's chest would tighten every time he heard her laugh, knowing he was the reason for it. Their nights became filled with passionate heat. Kaylin couldn't get enough of her. He would press her against the wall, his mouth claiming hers hungrily, his hands tugging at her clothes with desperate need. "You're mine, Alina," he would growl against her skin as she gasped beneath his touch. Alina blossomed under Kaylin's love. She glowed, her brown skin radiant beneath the soft glow of the moonlight as Kaylin traced his lips along her collarbone. She would wake in the middle of the night to find Kaylin's arms wrapped around her, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "I love you. I'll never let you go again." He took her to Paris for a weekend getaway, surprising her with a suite that overlooked the Eiffel Tower. He ordered champagne and strawberries, and they spent the night wrapped in silk sheets as the lights of the city flickered beneath them. Kaylin held Alina close, his hand sliding through her braids as he whispered, "I'm going to give you the life you deserve." Alina's heart fluttered as Kaylin kissed her deeply, his hands possessive and tender, as he worshipped her beneath the Paris moonlight. When they returned home, Kaylin made sure Alina felt his love in every gesture. He would draw her a bath after a long day, sitting on the edge of the tub as he washed her back with slow, tender strokes. He would brush her braids, his fingers gentle as he told her how beautiful she was. Kaylin started leaving notes in random places, inside her book, beneath her coffee cup, in her purse. "You're everything to me. I can't breathe without you. Thank you for waiting for me." Alina's heart melted each time she found one. They began hosting dinner parties together. Kaylin would stand behind Alina with his hands on her waist, introducing her to his colleagues as "my beautiful wife." His gaze would darken when men looked at her too long, his arm tightening around her waist as he whispered possessively in her ear, "Mine." Their bedroom became a sanctuary. Kaylin couldn't keep his hands off her. He would wake her in the middle of the night, his mouth tracing hot, open-mouthed kisses down her spine as he whispered, "I need you." Alina would gasp beneath his touch, her hands gripping the sheets as Kaylin worshipped her body with reverent hunger. "I love you," he would whisper again and again. Alina's heart soared as Kaylin pulled her close afterward, his hand resting possessively on her hip as they drifted to sleep. Kaylin became the man Alina had dreamed of, loving, passionate, and endlessly devoted. He would bring her coffee in bed, stay up late watching movies with her even when he was exhausted, and stroke her hair as she lay with her head on his chest. "I wasted 3 years," Kaylin would say sometimes, his dark eyes filled with regret. Alina would press her fingers to his lips and smile. "But we have forever now," she would whisper. Kaylin's lips would curve into a slow smile as he kissed her hand and murmured, "Forever." Their home filled with laughter, passion, and quiet happiness. Kaylin's business empire thrived, but now he knew the true meaning of success. It wasn't in boardrooms or financial statements. It was in the sound of Alina's laugh, the warmth of her skin beneath his hands, and the quiet peace of knowing that she was his, and he was hers, forever. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, a sea of dark velvet speckled with countless stars that shimmered like diamonds, casting a soft celestial glow over the garden where Alina and Kaylin sat. Alina rested her head on Kaylin's chest, her ear pressed against the steady rhythm of his heartbeat as his arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her close. The cool evening breeze whispered through the trees, stirring the scent of jasmine and roses that surrounded them, the soft rustling of leaves creating a quiet symphony that blended with the sound of their breathing. Alina's fingers traced small circles over Kaylin's chest, through the thin fabric of his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her touch. His other hand was entwined with hers, his thumb brushing lazily over the back of her hand. Kaylin's dark eyes were focused on the stars above them, but his attention was entirely on the woman in his arms. Alina's brown skin glowed beneath the silver moonlight, her long braids cascading over her shoulder as she tilted her head up to look at him. Her gaze was soft yet searching, and when her lips parted, her voice was quiet but clear. "Why did it take us so long to get here?" she asked, her tone carrying a mixture of vulnerability and quiet strength. Kaylin's jaw tensed slightly as her words settled between them, awakening the ghosts of the past that he had long tried to bury. He sighed deeply, his chest rising and falling beneath Alina's cheek as his hand slid up to her shoulder, his fingers brushing over her bare skin. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice low and rough with emotion. Alina's gaze softened, but she remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. "I thought if I focused on love, if I let myself feel too much, I'd lose my edge. I'd lose control." His hand tightened gently on her shoulder as his eyes darkened with the memory of those years. Years of cold distance, of hiding behind the armor of business and ambition, of telling himself that providing Alina with security was enough, that love was dangerous because it made a man vulnerable. "I convinced myself that building my empire, being successful, that was what mattered. But it was an excuse." Kaylin's voice lowered, his gaze growing sharp with self-awareness. "I didn't want to admit how much I needed you, how much I loved you." Alina's breath hitched as Kaylin's thumb brushed over her bottom lip, his gaze dark and intense as he stared down at her. "Loving you meant giving you the power to break me, and that terrified me." Alina's eyes filled with tears as Kaylin's thumb traced the curve of her jaw. "But I was wrong," he whispered. "You don't make me weaker, Alina. You make me stronger." Alina's lips trembled as tears slipped down her cheeks. Kaylin leaned down, his mouth brushing away the tears with soft, reverent kisses. "I wasted so much time," he murmured against her skin. Alina's hand came up to his cheek, her thumb stroking the rough line of his jaw, as she whispered, "We still have forever." Kaylin's gaze darkened, the moonlight reflecting in his deep brown eyes as he lowered his forehead to hers. "Forever," he repeated, his breath warm against her lips. His mouth claimed hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and aching with emotion. Alina melted against him, her hands sliding up to his neck as her fingers curled into his hair. Kaylin's arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her into his lap as his mouth moved over hers with quiet desperation. His hands slid down her back, pulling her closer as their kiss deepened. Alina's heart raced as Kaylin's lips left hers, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down her neck. "I love you," he breathed against her skin, his voice raw and heavy with emotion. "I love you so much." Alina's hands framed his face, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "I love you too." Kaylin's chest rose and fell beneath her palms as his lips found hers again, more urgent this time. He kissed her until they were both breathless, his hands sliding beneath her shirt to rest against the warm skin of her back. Alina trembled as Kaylin pulled her tighter against him, his mouth pressing to the side of her neck as he whispered, "You're my strength, Alina. You always have been." Alina's heart swelled as Kaylin's arms tightened around her. "I used to think love would make me weak," he said softly, his voice vibrating against her skin. "But when I look at you, when I'm with you, I know I can face anything." Alina smiled through her tears as her fingers tangled in his hair. "You don't have to face it alone anymore," she whispered. Kaylin's eyes darkened as he lifted her chin with his thumb. "Never again," he vowed. He kissed her deeply, his hands sliding down her back as he pulled her closer. The cool night air wrapped around them, but Alina felt nothing but the warmth of Kaylin's body and the steady, protective strength of his embrace. When they finally pulled apart, Kaylin's forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling as his fingers brushed tenderly down her back. "I was a fool," he whispered. Alina shook her head, her gaze tender as her fingers slid over his cheek. "You were protecting yourself, but now you know I'm not going anywhere." Kaylin's gaze softened as his hand curled around the back of her neck. "No more walls," he promised. Alina smiled, her heart swelling with quiet joy. "No more walls," she echoed. They sat beneath the stars for hours, wrapped in each other's arms. Kaylin held her close, his hands stroking her back as Alina's head rested against his chest. He whispered sweet words into her ear, his lips brushing over her temple as he promised her that he would never take her for granted again. Alina smiled as Kaylin's hand slid down to her waist, his touch gentle yet possessive. "I'm never letting you go," he whispered. Alina's fingers tightened over his hand as she replied, "You don't have to." Kaylin smiled, his heart pounding as he pulled her close and kissed her beneath the starlit sky. They sat together until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, their hearts beating as one at last. A few months had passed since Kaylin had finally opened his heart to Alina, and their marriage had blossomed into something beautiful, something sacred. Alina woke every morning to Kaylin's gentle kisses on her forehead, his strong arms wrapped around her waist as he whispered sweet words into her ear. He had become a different man, not in power or strength, but in the way he loved her openly and without restraint. The distance that had once defined their marriage was now replaced with warmth, passion, and unwavering devotion. Every day, Kaylin made sure Alina felt loved, desired, and cherished. He would leave work early to surprise her with flowers or take her on spontaneous dinner dates, holding her hand across the table as his eyes never left hers. He would sit behind her on the couch, his hands massaging her shoulders as they talked about their day. At night, Kaylin would pull her into his arms and kiss her deeply, his hands roaming her soft skin, as if he couldn't get enough of her. Alina's heart had never been fuller, never been more at peace. But now, sitting across from Kaylin in the soft glow of their sunlit living room, her heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested in her lap, her eyes flickering toward Kaylin, who was sitting on the edge of the couch, his gaze fixed on her with quiet concern. He had sensed her nervousness the moment she asked him to sit down, and now his dark brown eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Alina," he said softly, his deep voice laced with quiet concern. "What is it?" Alina swallowed hard, her heart thundering in her chest as she took a shaky breath. "I have something to tell you," she whispered, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Kellen's brows furrowed slightly, his hand reaching across the space between them to cover hers. His thumb brushed over her knuckles as he studied her expression carefully. "You can tell me anything," he said softly. Alina's lips parted, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment, the words stuck in her throat. But then she took a deep breath, her hand tightening around his. "Kaylin," her voice trembled, "I'm pregnant." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Kaylin's hand tightened over hers as his eyes widened, dark brown irises expanding with raw shock. His mouth parted slightly, his chest rising and falling beneath his crisp button-down shirt as the weight of her words settled over him. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice low and almost disbelieving. Alina nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes," she whispered, "we're going to have a baby." Kaylin's breath hitched sharply as he suddenly stood up, his hand still gripping hers as he pulled her up with him. "We're going to be parents?" His voice was thick with emotion, his eyes wide and vulnerable in a way Alina had never seen before. Alina nodded again, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes." Kaylin's hands slid down to her waist before he dropped to his knees in front of her. His large, strong hands settled gently on her belly, his thumbs stroking over the thin fabric of her dress as he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her stomach. Alina's breath hitched as Kaylin's hands flattened protectively over her abdomen, his body trembling slightly. "We're going to have a baby," he whispered, his voice hoarse and shaking. Tears gathered in his eyes as he pressed his lips to her stomach, his breath hitching against the soft fabric of her dress. "Alina?" His voice cracked as he lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers with raw, unfiltered emotion. "We're going to have a baby," he repeated, as though he needed to hear it again to believe it was real. Alina smiled through her tears as she slid her hands over his face, her thumbs brushing away the wetness beneath his eyes. "Yes, Kaylin," she whispered. "We're going to be parents." A deep, shaky breath left Kaylin's chest as he kissed her belly again, his hands stroking over her sides as his eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe it," he murmured. His breath hitched. "I thought I was too late. I thought I'd ruined everything." Alina's fingers slid through his hair as she whispered, "You didn't ruin anything, Kaylin. You saved us." Kaylin's arms wrapped around her waist as he buried his face against her stomach, his body trembling with the force of his emotion. "I'll be the best father," he whispered, his voice raw. "I promise you, Alina. I'll protect you both. I'll love you both more than anything." Alina's tears spilled over as she stroked his hair, her heart swelling at the depth of his devotion. Kaylin's hands slid back up her sides as he pressed soft, reverent kisses to her stomach, his breath warm against her skin, even through the thin fabric of her dress. His dark eyes lifted to hers, shining with tears as he whispered, "You've given me everything, Alina. I don't deserve you, but I swear to God, I will spend the rest of my life loving you and this baby." Alina's heart thudded painfully in her chest as Kaylin rose to his feet, his hands sliding up to cup her face. His gaze was dark and intense as he leaned down and kissed her deeply, his lips parting over hers in a kiss that was soft, yet desperate with love. Alina melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck as his hands slid down to cradle her belly once more. "I love you," he whispered against her mouth. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Alina whispered, her voice breaking as tears slid down her cheeks. Kaylin's thumb brushed over her lips before he kissed her again, longer this time, as though he could pour every ounce of his emotion into her through that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Kaylin's forehead pressed against hers as he whispered, "We're going to have a family." Alina smiled, her fingers sliding over his chest as she whispered, "Yes, we are." Kaylin's hand slid down to her belly again as his other hand curled around her back, pulling her against his chest. "I will love you both forever," he promised. "I will never let you down." Alina's eyes softened as her hands slid up to rest on his shoulders. "You never have," she whispered. Kaylin's arms wrapped tightly around her as he kissed the top of her head, his heart thundering with quiet joy and fierce protectiveness. "Thank you for giving me this," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me everything." Alina smiled as Kaylin's hands stroked over her stomach, his eyes dark and soft as he gazed down at her with a mixture of love and awe. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he said. Alina's heart melted as she whispered, "And you've made me feel loved." Kaylin smiled before leaning down and kissing her stomach once more, his hands caressing her sides as he whispered, "Our baby, our family." Alina's eyes filled with tears as Kaylin pulled her close again, his arms holding her tightly as they stood together, their hearts beating in perfect sync. Kaylin had always been a man of precision and control, a man whose life revolved around business meetings, high-stakes deals, and calculated decisions. But now his focus had shifted entirely, and his heart belonged to something far more precious, his growing family. From the moment Alina had told him she was pregnant, Kaylin had transformed into a man driven by love and fierce protectiveness. He had always loved Alina, but now that she carried their child, his devotion reached an entirely new level. He became utterly obsessed with her well-being, attending every single doctor's appointment without fail, his hand always resting protectively on her back or clutching her hand as he listened intently to the doctor's words. He would sit beside Alina during ultrasounds, his dark eyes widening with wonder every time the grainy image of their baby girl appeared on the screen. His fingers would tighten around Alina's hand as he heard the rapid, steady heartbeat, his chest constricting with overwhelming emotion. "She's perfect," he would whisper, his other hand brushing over Alina's belly as his eyes filled with awe. When they found out it was a girl, Kellen's reaction had been nothing short of breathtaking. He had pulled Alina into his arms right there in the doctor's office, his lips pressing fiercely against her forehead as tears shimmered in his dark eyes. "A daughter," he whispered, his hand sliding reverently over her rounded belly. "Our baby girl." From that moment on, Kellen became consumed with preparing for their daughter's arrival. He hired the best interior designer in the city to create a beautiful nursery, but he insisted on being involved in every detail. He personally picked out the softest pink and cream fabrics for the crib, the most delicate lace curtains for the windows, and hand-selected a plush rocking chair for Alina so she would be comfortable when nursing the baby. But it wasn't enough for him to just oversee the process. Keelan insisted on assembling the crib himself, even when the staff offered to handle it. Alina sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing softly as Keelan, in his tailored white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, crouched beside the half-built crib, a small frown of concentration on his face as he tightened the screws. "I'm capable, you know," Keelan said, glancing at her with a playful smirk. Alina laughed, her hand resting on her growing belly. "I'm just impressed you even know how to use a screwdriver." Keelan chuckled, setting the tool down as he moved toward her. His hands slid over her rounded belly, his eyes softening as he leaned down and pressed a tender kiss to her forehead. "I would learn how to build a whole house if it made you and our daughter happy," he murmured. Alina's heart swelled at the devotion in his voice, her fingers threading through his dark hair as he knelt in front of her, his hands still resting on her belly. "She's lucky to have you as her father," Alina whispered. Kellen's gaze darkened with emotion as he kissed her belly softly. "I'm the lucky one," he said, his voice thick. "She's not even here yet, and I already love her more than life itself." Every night, Kellen would talk to their daughter. After Alina had showered and settled into bed, Kellen would sit beside her, his hand sliding beneath her nightgown to gently stroke the bare skin of her belly. His large, warm palm would splay over the curve of her stomach as he leaned down and pressed his lips softly to her skin. "Hey, little princess," he would whisper, his voice low and soft. "It's Daddy." Alina would watch with tears in her eyes as Kellen whispered to their daughter, his lips brushing over her belly as his hand protectively cradled the curve of her stomach. "I can't wait to meet you," he would murmur. "I can't wait to hold you in my arms and see your little face. I hope you have your mother's smile. It's the most beautiful thing in the world." Alina's heart melted every time she watched Kalen's devotion. He would stay up late at night reading parenting books, his brows furrowed in concentration as he studied every detail about newborn care. He hired the best doctors and made sure Alina had everything she needed: massages, prenatal vitamins, the most comfortable maternity clothes. Kellen would even wake up in the middle of the night when Alina stirred, helping her out of bed and rubbing her back when she felt uncomfortable. One night, Alina woke up to find Kellen sitting beside the crib, his hand resting on the soft mattress as his eyes stared out the window. "Kellen," she murmured sleepily. He turned to her, his eyes soft in the dim light. "I was just thinking about her," he said quietly, "wondering what she'll look like, what her first word will be." Alina smiled, moving toward him as he pulled her down onto his lap. His hand instinctively slid over her belly as he pressed a soft kiss to her shoulder. "She'll have your eyes," Alina whispered. Kalen's gaze softened. "And your smile," he replied. "And your heart." Alina's hand slid over his as they both cradled her belly together. "She's going to love you so much," Alina whispered. Kaylin's throat worked as he pressed his forehead against her shoulder. "I already love her more than anything," he murmured. He was obsessed with every small detail about the pregnancy. When Alina felt the baby kick for the first time, Kaylin's eyes widened in awe as his hand pressed against her belly, feeling the small flutter beneath his palm. "She's strong," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like her mother." Alina smiled as Kaylin's lips pressed to her temple. "You're going to be an amazing father," she whispered. Kaylin's hand slid over her belly as he smiled down at her. "Because I have you," he replied. As the months passed, Kaylin became more protective than ever. He wouldn't let Alina lift anything heavy, even if it was just a small shopping bag. He would hold her hand as they walked through the park, his other hand resting protectively on her belly. When they went to baby stores, Kaylin would wander the aisles with a soft smile, picking out tiny dresses and soft blankets. He would hold them up with a playful grin. "This one?" he would ask, and Alina would laugh as she nodded. "She's going to be the most spoiled little girl," Alina teased. Kaylin's gaze softened. "She's going to be loved," he replied. "More than anything." Alina's heart melted as Kaylin's hand slid over her belly once more. "I can't wait to meet you, little princess," he whispered. "I promise I will love you forever." And Alina knew he would, because Kaylin had already given them both everything. His heart, his devotion, his love. And she knew that their daughter would be raised in a home filled with warmth, laughter, and endless love. Kaylin would make sure of it. The day Alina gave birth to their baby girl was the most emotional and life-changing day of Kaylin's life. He had prepared for this moment for months, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the wave of raw, overwhelming love that would crash over him the moment he saw his daughter. From the moment Alina went into labor, Kaylin was by her side, clutching her hand tightly as he whispered soft reassurances into her ear, his dark eyes filled with concern and fierce devotion. Alina's face was pale with pain, beads of sweat dotting her forehead as the contractions worsened, but Kaylin refused to leave her side for even a second. "You're doing amazing, baby," he whispered, brushing the damp braids away from her forehead as she squeezed his hand so tightly his fingers throbbed. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Alina's breath hitched as another contraction tore through her, her face contorting in pain. "Kaylin, I can't. It hurts so much." Kaylin's heart twisted at the sight of her suffering, his jaw tightening as he pressed his forehead to hers. "You can do this, Alina," he whispered, his voice low and steady despite the fear tightening his chest. "You're the strongest woman I know. I'm so proud of you. I love you so much." Alina's breath shuddered as Kaylin's lips brushed over her temple. When the doctor announced that it was time to push, Kaylin's heart raced wildly in his chest. He held Alina's hand tightly, his knuckles white as he watched her fight through the pain, his heart shattering as he saw tears of agony slip down her cheeks. "You've got this, baby," he whispered. "Just a little more. I'm right here. I've got you." Alina screamed through the final push, and then suddenly the room was filled with the soft, piercing sound of a newborn's cry. Kaylin's breath caught as the doctor held up the tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "It's a girl," the doctor announced. Kaylin's knees nearly gave out as he watched the nurse clean the baby off and wrap her carefully. His throat tightened as the nurse approached and gently placed the baby into his arms. Kaylin's breath hitched as he looked down at the delicate little face peeking out from the pink blanket. Her tiny features were soft and perfect, rosy cheeks, a button nose, and the smallest mouth he had ever seen. His hands trembled as he cradled her close to his chest, his dark eyes wide with awe as tears slipped down his cheeks. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She's perfect." He slowly sat down beside Alina's bed, his free hand brushing over her damp hair as she smiled weakly at him. "She looks like you," Alina whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with warmth and love. Kellen shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the precious little face of his daughter. "No," he whispered. "She's perfect because she has you." His heart throbbed as he pressed a soft kiss to his daughter's forehead. Her small fingers curled around his pinky, and Kalen's heart nearly stopped at the sensation of her delicate touch. His eyes filled with tears as he lifted her tiny hand to his lips and kissed it reverently. "Lila," Alina whispered. Kalen's gaze shifted to his wife, his eyes softening as he smiled. "Lila," he repeated, tasting the name on his tongue like it was the sweetest thing he'd ever spoken. "Our little Lila." Alina's eyes shimmered with tears as Kalen leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips. "You gave me the greatest gift in the world," he whispered. "I love you so much, Alina, and I swear I will protect both of you with my life." Alina smiled softly as her hand rested on Kalen's cheek. "You already have." Kalen sat with Lila in his arms for hours, unwilling to put her down even when the nurses offered to take her. He cradled her against his chest, his hand brushing over the fine dark hair on her head as he watched her tiny chest rise and fall with each soft breath. When Lila opened her eyes for the first time, Kalen's heart stopped. Her eyes were large and bright, Alina's eyes. Kalen's throat tightened with emotion as he kissed her forehead. "You're going to have the most beautiful life, Lila," he whispered. "I'm going to make sure of it." Over the next few days, Kalen became completely obsessed with Lila. He didn't let anyone else hold her unless Alina insisted. He would sit beside Alina as she nursed Lila, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, his eyes glued to their daughter's face. At night, Kalen would sit beside Lila's bassinet, watching her sleep for hours. His large hand would rest on her tiny chest, feeling the soft, steady rise and fall of her breathing. "You're my whole world now," he would whisper, his lips brushing over her tiny hand. "I love you so much, baby girl." Alina watched Kalen with tears in her eyes, her heart swelling with love every time she saw him with Lila. He would wake up in the middle of the night at the smallest sound, rushing to Lila's side to check on her. He would change her diapers without hesitation, sing to her when she cried, and rock her to sleep in his arms. Alina's heart melted when she walked into the nursery one night to see Kalen sitting in the rocking chair with Lila resting on his bare chest. He was shirtless, his muscular arms wrapped securely around her tiny frame as he hummed a soft lullaby. His dark head was bent over Lila's tiny form, his large hand cupping the back of her head as she sighed softly in her sleep. Alina's throat tightened as she watched them, love swelling so fiercely in her chest it almost hurt. "You're amazing," Alina whispered. Kellen lifted his gaze, his dark eyes soft as he smiled. "She's everything," he murmured. "Both of you are." Alina walked over and leaned down to press a soft kiss to his lips. "We love you too," she whispered. Kalen's eyes darkened with emotion as he pulled Alina down onto his lap, cradling both his wife and daughter against his chest. "We're a family now," he whispered, "a perfect family." Alina smiled as Lila stirred softly in Kalen's arms. "And we always will be." Kalen pressed a soft kiss to Alina's temple, his hand tightening around Lila's tiny body. "Forever," he promised. "I'll love both of you forever." And in that quiet moment, wrapped in the warmth of his wife and daughter, Kalen knew he had everything he would ever need: his family, his heart, his whole world. Years later, Kalen and Alina stood side by side on the terrace of their grand estate, the golden rays of the late afternoon sun casting a soft glow over the sprawling garden where their daughter, Lila, was playing. Lila's giggles echoed through the warm breeze as she chased a butterfly across the vibrant blooms of roses and lilies, her long dark hair cascading down her back in soft waves, the sun catching the rich brown hues that mirrored Kayleen's own. Kayleen's dark eyes softened as he watched their daughter, his heart swelling with pride and love at the sight of the little girl who had become the center of their universe. Alina stood beside him, her body tucked beneath the protective strength of his arm as his hand rested on the curve of her hip, pulling her close. Her head leaned against his chest, and Kaylin pressed a soft kiss to the crown of her head, inhaling the delicate floral scent that still drove him mad with desire after all these years. "We wasted too much time," Kaylin murmured, his voice low and filled with quiet regret as his gaze remained fixed on Lila, who was now crouched down, examining a flower with the innocent curiosity only a child could possess. Alina's soft hand slid over his chest, her touch grounding him, her warmth soothing the lingering wounds of their past. "But we made up for it," Alina whispered, her voice filled with quiet strength and unwavering love. Kaylin's dark eyes met hers, and his heart clenched at the depth of devotion reflected in those soft brown depths. She had given him so much, her heart, her patience, her forgiveness, and now she had given him a family. Kaylin's hand slid to her cheek, his thumb brushing over her soft skin as he leaned down and captured her lips in a deep, lingering kiss. Alina melted into him, her arms curling around his neck as he pulled her closer, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude into that kiss. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, his eyes dark and intense as he whispered, "Never again. From now on, love comes first." Alina's eyes shimmered with tears as she smiled, her hand lifting to brush over his jawline. "Always," she whispered. Kaylin's hand slid down to her waist as his other hand laced with hers, their fingers intertwining in a silent promise. He had learned his lesson the hard way. Allowing business and ambition to overshadow the love of his life had nearly cost him everything. But Alina had stayed. She had fought for him even when he hadn't deserved it. And now he knew with absolute certainty that he would never make that mistake again. Their marriage had become a testament to the power of love and patience, a reminder that true success wasn't measured in business deals or financial gain, but in the quiet, precious moments shared between two hearts that had chosen to beat as one. Kaylin and Alina had built a life together that was steeped in love and understanding, a life where laughter filled every room and warmth radiated from every corner of their home. Kaylin had learned to balance his career and his family, ensuring that business never took precedence over the people who meant everything to him. He made time for Alina and Lila, carving out moments for quiet breakfasts in bed, spontaneous weekend getaways, and lazy afternoons spent in the garden, watching Lila chase butterflies and listening to Alina's soft laughter. Alina had blossomed under Kaylin's unwavering devotion, her eyes sparkling with happiness as he showered her with affection, bringing her flowers for no reason other than to see her smile, drawing her into passionate kisses whenever they found themselves alone, holding her hand beneath the table during dinner as Lila babbled about her day. Kaylin became the father he had always dreamed of being, attending Lila's school events, reading her bedtime stories every night, and carrying her on his shoulders through the park as she squealed with joy. His heart swelled every time Lila reached for him, her small arms wrapping around his neck as she whispered, "I love you, Daddy." Kaylin's eyes would fill with tears as he kissed her hair, whispering, "I love you more, little princess." Alina watched Kaylin with pride and admiration, her heart swelling with love every time she saw the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at Lila. Kaylin was no longer the emotionally distant businessman who had once allowed ambition to cloud his heart. He had become the man she had always known he could be, strong, protective, and utterly devoted. Their love had grown deeper with each passing year, strengthened by the challenges they had overcome and the unwavering commitment they had made to each other. Kaylin often woke up in the middle of the night just to watch Alina sleep, his hand brushing over her bare shoulder as moonlight bathed her soft features. He would press a kiss to her forehead and whisper, "I love you," even though she was fast asleep. Alina would stir, a soft smile curling her lips as she whispered, "I love you too." Kaylin's heart would clench every time, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of his love for her. They learned that business and success could never replace the warmth of a loving touch or the sound of shared laughter. Kaylin had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of in the business world, but none of it had truly mattered until Alina and Lila became the center of his life. He had once believed that strength came from power and control, but Alina had shown him that true strength lay in vulnerability, in opening his heart and allowing himself to love without fear. On quiet evenings, Kaylin and Alina would sit on the terrace, watching the sun set over the horizon as Lila played in the garden. Kaylin's arm would rest around Alina's shoulders, his hand idly brushing through her hair as they sat in comfortable silence, simply existing in the warmth of each other's presence. Kaylin would sometimes press a kiss to Alina's temple and say, "We did it." Alina would smile, her hand curling around his. "We did." Their love story wasn't perfect. It had been marked by mistakes and heartache, but it was real. It was built on forgiveness, understanding, and an unbreakable bond that had only grown stronger with time. Kaylin had learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other over and over again, even when things got hard. And so, as they watched Lila chase butterflies beneath the golden light of the setting sun, Kaylin knew that they had already built the most precious legacy of all. Not the business empire that Kaylin had once thought would define his success, but the love and laughter that filled their home. Kaylin's lips brushed against Alina's ear as he whispered, "Forever." Alina smiled, her hand tightening around his. "Forever." And with that quiet promise, sealed beneath the fading light of the setting sun, Kaylin knew with absolute certainty that they had finally found their happily ever after. Lesson: don't let life's distractions steal the love and intimacy from your marriage. Success and business will come and go, but the warmth of your partner's love is irreplaceable. Love deeply, passionately, and without hesitation. Kaylin and Alina had learned this truth through their journey. Years of silence and distance, replaced by devotion, intimacy, and unconditional love. As they stood together, watching their daughter play, they knew that nothing in the world could compare to the gift of love and family. Kaylin tightened his hold on Alina's waist, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "From now on, love comes first," he whispered. Alina smiled, her heart full. They had fought for their love, reclaimed what was lost, and built a future filled with warmth and laughter. No amount of success or money could ever compare to the peace of a happy heart and a loving home. They had learned that true fulfillment didn't lie in business deals or financial achievements. It was in the quiet moments, the gentle touches, and the shared glances that spoke volumes. As the sun set, casting golden light over their perfect family, Alina whispered, "Thank you, Jesus, for bringing us back to love."